So welcome everybody to this Permaculture magazine event, where I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Wade Muggleton, who's an orchardist and author of the Orchard book. Wade's been interested in permaculture since the 1990s, when he was traveling in New Zealand and Australia, where it originated. He came home, became a college lecturer and a countryside officer in local government. Now he lives in Shropshire with his partner and his two children, where they have a plot which is called Station Road Permaculture Gardens, which has been a demonstration site for permaculture, as well as open under the National Open Gardens scheme. In 2013, Wade was able to expand his ambitions and acquire a field where he's subsequently planted a full-scale orchard. He now has a collection of over 130 fruit trees, and he's been featured on BBC Gardener's World in 2018. And Wade has written for many years for Permaculture magazine, which has been a pleasure for us to publish his articles, so much so that we asked him if he would write us the Orchard book, and I'm happy to say he agreed. So my first question, Wade, and welcome again, is your book's called the Orchard book, but you very much speak about fruit trees being scalable at any size of plot. Could you tell me a little bit more about how you see that working?
Okay, well, firstly, thanks very much for having me tonight. Yeah, I think orchard is a lovely sort of rich, evocative word, and it probably conjures up different images to different people. For some people, it might be big trees in blossom or fruit with sheep grazing underneath, or it could be sort of orange groves or something. So it is a very sort of symbolic word, but it actually means a place where fruit trees grow. So you can have a micro orchard or a back garden orchard or an allotment orchard. So it's really just a place where fruit trees grow, and it can be of any scale. We perhaps have images of rolling orchards in the countryside, but you can equally have a small orchard in an urban area or 4 or 5 trees on an allotment. So it can be literally any scale that people like or have the room to accommodate, really.
Can you tell me a little bit about, therefore, Station Road Permaculture and the orchard element in that? Because it very much demonstrates smaller scale fruit growing, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, we moved here 20 years ago, and we live in an ex-local authority red brick semi. So I always call it a very ordinary plot, sort of tens of thousands of houses up and down the country that are very similar. And it has a rectangular plot out the back. And we'd never owned a property before. So after years of rented, we got very excited when we finally managed to buy our own. And having our own garden gave us the opportunity to do things like plant fruit trees, which is more permanent. You tend not to do that in sort of rented properties. So we set the garden up thinking that was the limit of our ambitions, really. So there were 35 fruit trees in the garden in various forms of stepovers and espaliers and cordons and things, and a raised bed vegetable system, some chickens, 2 greenhouses, half a dozen water butts, 2 ponds. So we sort of shoehorned a lot of stuff in. And part of the reason that we open it and show it to people is because I think a lot of people have sort of grand ambitions and then feel deflated by their own little plot. But we hopefully inspire people to show that you can do a lot with a small plot. I think there's a tendency in this country to revere the grand and the opulent gardens, which are amazing. But when you come back to your semi or your estate house or your terrace, you perhaps think, oh, well, I can't really do much. So I think little demonstration sites are really valuable in showing what you can do with a small space.
Absolutely, it gives us hope. And also there's something about concentrating on designing and planting and maintaining a small area, because, you know, particularly when gardeners are inexperienced, it feels attainable and something that can be managed. Whereas if a project's too ambitious or a garden's too big, it can be actually quite disheartening in the end and exhausting. and
Yeah, and I
get
think
away.
breaking things into manageable chunks is always a good thing.
Yeah.
The reason I love raised bed gardening is because if you've got 20 minutes to spare, you can just concentrate and get on top of one raised bed, weeding it, planting it, whatever. And you're right, like I think people aspire to having vast acreages, but actually it's an enormous commitment and an enormous amount of work. So sometimes small is beautiful, as E.F. Schumacher said all those years ago.
Brilliant. Right, so we've been talking about small gardens and orcharding, but can you tell us a little bit about this? For some people, it can be a bit confusing. So a little bit about rootstocks, what they are, and how to select the right ones for your garden.
Okay, yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that when you go to a nursery or a garden centre and you buy a fruit tree, you're buying something that is completely unnatural, because what you're actually buying is two different pieces of tree that have been spliced together in the middle by a graft. And the reason that we have to do this is because apple trees in particular, or fruit trees, don't come true from pips or seeds. So I've got an apple here, which is a Spartan out of my orchard. And if we were to cut this up, take the pips out and plant them, it would grow into an apple tree and it will produce apples, but they wouldn't be Spartans. They'd only be half Spartan, because the other half would be whatever they were pollinated with. So apples and fruit trees are subject to cross-pollination, therefore they don't come true from seed. So if you're planting rocket in your garden and you let it go to seed, you just collect the seeds and plant it and you get rocket again. But with apples, you won't get the same apple again. So therefore, in order to get the variety that you want, you have to take a cutting. So it's vegetative propagation rather than by seed, which leads to the conclusion that there was only one each of every variety originally. And all the versions of that are just cuttings of cuttings of cuttings of that original tree. So we can't grow, if we're a nurseryman, we can't raise fruit trees from pips and seeds. We have to grow them vegetatively. Now, if you take a piece off a willow tree or a poplar tree and you push it in the ground, it just roots and grows away. But fruit trees generally don't do that. They don't root themselves. So we have to supply them with a set of roots. So I tend to talk a lot about apples because that's my subject. So in the case of apples, we get an apple rootstock and we graft the cutting of the variety we want onto the top of it. And rootstocks have been developed by nurserymen and women over many years, not for the type of fruit they produce, but for the vigor and health that they grow. So if you want a dwarf tree for a small garden, you need to get a small rootstock. So that's a tree that was cultivated originally because it stays quite small and compact. It's a healthy, young, small rootstock. So that will only ever give you a tree of a certain size. So the variety on the top can be exactly the same, but it will behave differently depending on which set of roots you put it on. So you could have a Spartan as a little tiny dwarf tree in your garden, or you could have it as a standard, produce the same apples, but the rootstock are what's driving the growth and vigor of the tree. So that's why I always advocate using specialist fruit tree nurseries. You know, talking to people, tell them what you want, and you'll get the right advice and the right tree for your plot.
Yeah, thank you very much, because it can be a bit mysterious, and certainly if you end up with too vigorous a tree in too smaller a space, you have a lot of work on your hands keeping it at the right size, and takes a lot of pruning.
It is a mysterious thing, because the idea that you can graft something it still fills me with a sort of schoolboy sense of wonder that you can rip a bit off one tree and splice it onto another tree and it grows away. And you sort of wonder who in history first had that light bulb moment. And we know that the Greeks and the Romans grafted, so it's a very ancient technique. But the fact you can just literally take a bit off one tree and stick it on another tree. And, you know, I've got one in my front garden that's got 7 different apples growing on the same tree because I've added different cuttings to the original tree.
And I believe that you graft onto hawthorn, don't you?
I've only done it as a novelty thing. It's just that pears for some reason will grow on hawthorn. I don't quite understand the botany of that because they're not the same genus or species, but I don't use it as a general thing. I think pear on pear and apple on apple is the best way to go. I did once give a talk, and a little lady at the back listened very attentively, and at the end of it she said, "I've got this cherry tree in my garden. It's never been any good. Do you think I could put some apples on it?" So I had to explain that you can't quite stretch the laws of biology that far.
I also have another question, which is about what best rootstocks for pears. I mean, we have talked already about rootstocks, but I have a particular request for advice on rootstocks and
Okay, well,
pears.
a lot of pears these days come on quince rootstocks, because pears and quinces are sort of cousins, if you like, and they're very closely related, so you can grow them on each other's rootstocks. So a lot of quince stocks are less vigorous. So if you put a pear on a quince, on a quince rootstock, it keeps it smaller for a garden situation. But pear trees can live an extraordinarily long time, 200, 250 years maybe, like some of the big Perry pears and ancient pear trees. So if you want a pear that is going to get into a very, very big tree and live for a long time, you really want it on a pear rootstock, Pyrus communis, a wild pear rootstock. But if you want a garden tree, then yeah, they tend to come on quince rootstocks now, which reduces that vigor, because pears can be quite vigorous and get extremely tall. So in a field, I would advocate, if you want to do it traditionally, have them on a pear rootstock. But for a garden, yeah, most of them come on quince rootstocks now.
Do you have a favourite pear? Or is that
well,
another unfair
I've got a real
question?
soft spot for this Worcester black pear, because it is
Yeah,
the county emblem, but it's a cooking pear. You can't eat them, you know, off the tree. But it's just it's an interesting pear because they keep right through the winter. And in Tudor times, they were incredibly popular because you could eat fresh fruit in January and February when there wasn't much else around. And in the days of big hearty pudding eating and things, pears and these hard cooking pears were a really valuable thing. So that's probably the one that I actually wrote a booklet about the Worcester black pear. So yeah, somebody once said to me, you wrote an entire book about one pear, and I went, absolutely, of course.
Why not?
Yeah, exactly. But it's very historic. There's that old joke that there's only like 10 minutes in the life of a pear when it's truly ripe, and the skill is engaging when those are, because sometimes you can keep things like Burr Hardy and Doyen de Comiste on the windowsill and they look great, and then you cut them open and they've started to rot from the middle outwards.
Yeah.
So it's a real sort of art to kind of, and if you keep them in a cold place, they'll keep longer. And then when you bring them in the house, that accelerates the ripening. So the skill of like the old sort of housekeepers in the big houses and things of supplying, you know, pears to the squire's table must have been a bit of a pressure to get it right, because they'd keep them in a cold store or somewhere, and then they'd bring them in and they had to get the judgment just right as to when they would be ready for serving. So they are tricky, and that's, I think, why pears aren't as popular as apples, because they're harder to get right in terms of eating, and they don't store quite as easily. So apples are the commonest, most widely grown top fruit in Britain anyway. Yeah. And it is fast food, isn't it? It's just the ultimate fast food, really.
But pears juice nicely.
Yeah, they are. A pear when it's right is fantastic, but it's not easy to get it right.
No. So, as we know, there used to be thousands and thousands of varieties of apples, but certainly there are hundreds of easily attainable varieties of apple, depending on your local nursery particularly, and what thrives in an area. But how do you choose, when you're starting out, how do you make the choice of what to plant, and how do you decide what works best in the garden and better in the field?
Well, I suppose there's two sort of approaches to that. But the reason there are so many is because of that thing about genetic diversity, that every time you plant a pip, you get a different one. So all the varieties were just originally a pip that somebody thought grew into a decent apple, and therefore they propagated it. So you can either find out what the local varieties of your area were, because the theory being, if they developed in your area, they'll do well in your area. Although there's a school of thought that climate change might sort of push the parameters of that a bit, because if it's not the same conditions, or you go for sort of tried and tested varieties. Certain varieties have endured down the decades because they are good varieties. But I often get asked by people, I want to put 3 or 4 trees in my garden, what do you suggest? And I always sort of cringe slightly, because I never know because everyone's different, aren't they? It's like beer or wine or something. Everyone has their individual palate. Some people like red or white, some people like lager or ale. So what I suggest is that you need to go to autumn shows, apple days, community events, farm shops, pester your neighbours and friends for what they've got in their garden, and just try as many as possible. Find out which ones you like, and then go and seek it as a tree from a specialist nursery. because I might have my sort of half a dozen favorites, but they won't necessarily be someone else's. And you do get into odd conversations with people where they wax lyrical about some apple, and I sort of think to myself, God, I don't rate that one at all. So it is utterly a subjective thing, but there's no substitute for just trying as many as possible in September, October, November. And there are lots of apple days and events now. So the whole apple culture really has grown massively since the 90s. The little charity Common Ground did that exercise of mapping the apples of Britain, and it all grew off the back of that, really.
Yeah, that was a lovely project. A great organisation. So do you have favourites though? I mean, you must do.
Yeah, I do.
Of your 130 and growing collection.
Yeah. I mean, my orchard doesn't make any sense commercially because it's just one each of lots of things. And some of the ones I've got are probably in less than half a dozen places in the world. So I've got some ridiculously obscure things. But if you want an apple to pick in September and eat off the tree, I think Discovery is probably is the finest early apple, in my opinion. It's the classic kind of storybook red apple. Pick it off the tree and eat it. Keep it in the fruit bowl for 3 weeks and it's gone completely past it. But as something to eat off the tree, that's fantastic. I like a little apple called Pitmaston Pineapple because, as I once read, it's small, yellow and spotty. So it's everything the supermarkets hate, but it actually tastes fantastic. And my other favorite is one called May Queen, which is an old Worcester variety. But yeah, I've got my few favorites that I like, but as I say, other people will have theirs. So there's no substitute for just trying as many as possible.
I have to say, I love Bardsey Island apple.
Okay.
I absolutely love it. It grows on chalk very happily, which is great because where I was growing apples was on chalk downlands in Hampshire. It's hard to grow apples on bare chalk, but we managed. And Bardsey is such a vigorous, healthy, happy tree, and they're crisp and juicy, yellow apples with a red blush. So
and it's got that great story about supposedly coming
to
the Isle of Bardsey and being bashed by salt-laden winds and storms.
There's a romance to that apple, but it is hardy and it doesn't mind a bit of tough treatment. So
I do have that. Favorites. That is one of my 106 or whatever.
And a little word of warning about not going out and perhaps buying the variety that you might have been liked in the supermarket.
Yeah, I think it's a shame that that most people only know the 4 or 5 you find in the supermarket, and these days it's like Gala, Braeburn, Pink Lady, Jazz, and even Granny Smith and Golden Delicious aren't as popular as they used to be. But some of those varieties are very Cox's Orange Pippin's a good example. It's quite disease prone, and when they grow it commercially, they do spray it a lot, so it doesn't necessarily make a good garden tree. So, and I often say to people, why do you want to grow an apple that you can buy in the shops? Grow something that you can't buy anywhere. There's something great about walking out and picking an apple off a tree that you could not go and buy anywhere. And there's 2,000 plus varieties easily. So
absolutely, and it's such an adventure, isn't it? So we've talked a little bit about apple days and local events, but if we want to go and eat apples off the tree and just see apples growing in different situations, do you have any other recommends for good places to see orchards?
Well, I think the historic heartlands of orcharding really are the places where you might still find some fantastic orchards. And I live sort of on the edge of the 3 counties of Worcestershire, Gloucestershire and Herefordshire. Yeah, I mean, you I think live in one of the other ones now, Devon and Somerset. So and obviously Kent and Sussex as well, where the other sort of historic heartlands. So those are the sort of places that you will find, remnant traditional orchards. That's right.
And it is fascinating looking at the traditional orchards and I've only been here since the autumn, so I did get the fruiting season, and also the resurgence of large cider orchards and juice orchards that are coming back into Somerset, and watching how they're managed as well.
Yeah, sort of artisan cider and perry has made a real comeback in the last 20 years, and that has been the saviour of some orchards, because the reason a lot of traditional orchards sort of fell out of favour was because they didn't really contribute to the farm economy anymore. So it was a case of if they didn't pay their way, they got cut down and disappeared. And that's why a lot of orchards went, because they just didn't have an economic value anymore. But if they can sort of support these artisan drinks companies, that's a great way of validating the existence of the orchards. But also, because the fruit gets juiced, it doesn't have to be perfect and blemish free. Whereas the supermarkets want these perfect apples that don't have any sort of blemishes on at all. So yeah, the juicing side of it is a really exciting sort of way forward.
Can you tell us some of your mainly chemical-free or totally chemical-free maintenance strategies in your home garden and your field orchard as well?
Well, I sort of tend to take the view that a healthy tree is a happy tree. So all you can do really is to give the tree what it needs. So I'm a huge fan of mulching. I'm quite lucky you've got access to a lot of well-rotted farmyard manure. So at this time of the year, I try and give them a barrow full each, sort of round the base. I tend to concentrate on the younger trees because I don't get around 130 barrowfuls of muck necessarily, and also wood chip from sort of tree surgery waste and stuff, if you can get hold of it, is fantastic for mulching. And I think we might talk a bit about pruning, but to create a light, open, airy tree that's free of disease. It's got a lot of sunlight hitting it. So if you give the tree the right conditions, so mulch it to keep the moisture in, feed it with some rotting down mulch, and keep it in a healthy condition, then it will hopefully perform for you because it's happy and growing well. And the other thing is this remorial wood chip, where you chip willow and young stuff, and then you use that as a mulch, and it's supposed to be really invigorating for mycorrhizal activity and the like. So yes, I know a few people that are into remorial wood chip mulches.
Yes, one of our other authors to be, Pippa Chapman, is a real fan of remorial wood chip because of the mycorrhiza in it, rather than buying expensive treatments.
Yeah. Well, my one concession to a noisy petrol guzzling machine is my little petrol chipper, which has been a revelation in terms of just processing all the prunings and any other sort of tree loppings and bits and bobs and making home produced wood chip, which is fantastic. So that's my concession to a little fossil fuel guzzling machine, but it is a great piece of kit in the orchard. When you've got 100 odd trees, you can just chip all your prunings and recycle it around the system.
Some traditional wisdom is don't ever chip your fruit prunings, your fruit tree prunings, because you might spread disease. But I went to see Martin Crawford's forest garden a few years ago, and he literally said, I prune it and then I chuck it on the ground underneath the tree and form mulch with it. And I thought, gosh, I've been religiously removing my prunings and burning them, to my neighbours not particularly appreciating that, because you're burning green wood, so it's smoky. So you don't worry about such things?
I mean,
Do you worry about
if I find a great big lump of canker, like in a branch, I will get rid of that. But no, the rest of it all just gets chipped back onto the floor. So yeah, goes round and round in the system. Yeah. Because again, coming back to my, healthy trees are happy trees. Ideally, I'm not overly obsessive about this whole sort of hygiene thing in the orchard. I think if the trees are healthy, and I've got 106 varieties, and most of them are at 600 feet on a northwest facing slope. Well, after 8 years, some of them are thriving and some are maybe not quite as thriving. So that's just an experiment about varietal suitability, isn't it? Some will like the Shropshire Hills and others won't like the Shropshire Hills. And over time, I may end up with a slightly different mixture because one or two might not make it and others will do really well. So it is just it's an experiment. Every day is a school day, isn't it, in terms of gardening and orcharding?
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing that we found was that if we had a wildflower meadow underneath our fruit trees as the ground layer, then it brought in so many beneficial insects that attracted bats as well, and the bats then ate the codlin moth, and we never had any problems with those kind of pests in with our fruit trees because it was such a diverse, bountiful system with all the wildflowers and the hedgerows around the trees.
Yeah,
So
healthy environment gives you
yeah,
healthy trees, hopefully. So, and it's about that balance, isn't it, of having people say, yes, there will be pests and predators, but there'll also be, useful predators that keep the aphids down, and the moth larvae and the things you don't really want. So,
and things like, ponds, bringing in frogs and toads, and because when in the first early years of establishing our fruit trees, we were doing it on a field that had been an arable field, so it had, the slugs literally climbed up the apple trees and ate the leaves, and so we put in as many ponds as were useful just to get the amphibian population up, and eventually we ended up with things like common lizard and slow worms, which were also really useful creatures to have.
I mean, my young orchard's not got big enough trees in it to support bird boxes, so I just put some posts in and put about 8 bird boxes on sort of a post about 4 foot off the ground, and the blue tits nest in them, and then you see them going backwards and forwards from the trees feeding on the caterpillars. So it's sort of free organic pest control, and that's a really easy thing to do. Just put a bird box on a pole, and lo and behold, several of them every year get used. So they're doing the pest control for me and feeding their young at the same time. So, and
you have the pleasure of it.
It's a win-win.
Yeah. So you mentioned a minute or so ago the P word for pruning.
Yeah.
And to the newbie to growing fruit, it can seem quite intimidating and a little bit esoteric as a practice. Can you tell us a little bit about what you'd recommend the best ways of learning pruning?
The best way to learn pruning is to go and do it hands-on with somebody. It's one of those things that I speak to so many people and they say, I can't work it out from a book. It's really difficult flat on the page. I mean, I didn't attempt in my book to sort of tell people how to do it. I discussed, why we prune, because we don't necessarily prune an oak tree growing in the woods. So why do we prune a fruit tree? Well, we prune a fruit tree to get better quality fruit rather than quantity. It's not about quantity, because it's better to have 100 apples that are fully sized and fully ripe than to have 200 little things the size of a golf ball that never ripen. And we prune to let light and air into the tree, because it's the light that ripens the fruit, and good airflow will flush away spores and disease. So a fruit tree shouldn't be a crowded, dense structure. It should be a nice open, airy structure. And then we might prune to keep a tree a certain size in a garden. So we might just prune it regularly to keep it within a certain size. And then lastly, we sort of prune out damage and decay and anything like that. It used to be said that you'd always prune out all the dead wood, but dead wood is a fantastic habitat for beetles and micro flies and all sorts of pollinators and things. So we're perhaps a bit more tolerant these days of having some dead wood in a tree than the historical thing of chopping it all out and burning it. So dead wood is a good thing. But yeah, that's why we prune. But you really want to go on a course, go and ask somebody who's doing it if you can give them a hand, or learn hands-on. There isn't really an easy way to teach it from a flat page, because it's such a three-dimensional thing to do.
You have made quite a useful YouTube on pruning though.
A little bit, yeah, a bit, but
pretty useful. So we have a question actually from someone who's listening here, and they're asking, when do you start pruning? My trees are still very young.
Well, there's 2 schools of pruning. There's summer pruning and winter pruning. All the little dwarf trees like stepovers and cordons and espaliers and things are summer pruned. So what you do with there is you cut back the current season's growth, and because fruit trees don't crop on the current season's growth, you're not wasting any fruit. So you're just cutting back this year's extension growth as far as you can, down to maybe 2 or 3 leaves to create fruiting spurs. And what that does is, if you do that in about August, it lets light onto the fruit for the last 6 or 7 weeks to ripen it. And the biology of it is that by pruning the tree when it's in full leaf, you sort of shock it. And the shocking process makes it throw more fruit the next year, because living things, if they think they're under attack or are going to die, genetically want to reproduce. So therefore, the theory is that it will throw more fruit the next year. But big old trees do tend to be winter pruned, and pruning was often done in November, December time, but that was because it fitted the farming year, because the harvest was in and you'd potentially got a lot of labor. with not so much to do. So it wasn't that November and December is necessarily the only or perfect time to do it. It happened to fit the farming year. Standard trees are very difficult to summer prune because when they're in full leaf, you just can't really see what you're doing. But all the little garden stuff, it reduces the vigor by doing it in the summer because you're chopping off some of the leaves, so it's not doing as much photosynthesizing afterwards. And it supposedly shocks it into throwing more. So I tend to prune all my little stuff in the garden in about August. And then I tend to prune my bigger standard trees probably. Well, I've been doing some this week, so about now really, or when I've got time over the winter. I think we can get very over precious about it. I think in the past people did it when they had the time to do it. And you get people that say, oh, you shouldn't prune in the frost because it'll cause dieback. And other people say you should prune in the frost because it sterilizes all the cuts. I think we can be overly sort of navel gazing about it. They're very hardy. You can hit them quite hard and they respond. Apples and pears are tough as old boots, really.
And what age do you start? I guess it depends on whether you've got a small dwarfing tree or a standard.
Yeah, and it depends whether it's going in the direction you want it to go or filling the space you want it to fill. If you've got in your mind the sort of shape you want it to be and there's an erratic branch that goes off at a really horrid angle that jars to the eye, then lop it off so it doesn't waste any more energy growing that branch. So you can start from 2 or 3 years really, start to shape them. And it's a bit like good pruning when they're young will set the tree on the right path for the rest of its life. Whereas if you let it go doing nothing for 10 or 15 years and then you give it a severe cut, you kind of can end up with a bit of a mutated tree.
You can. So what do you do with your harvests?
We do obviously end up, when you've got like 100 and whatever apple trees I've got, you do end up with a lot of fruit. And certainly the last couple of years now, my main orchard's now in its 8th year, and my garden orchards, some of them are in their sort of 19th, 20th year. We make apple juice out of the majority of it. So we have a community press where we live in the village, and we press our apples. I have a pasteurizer, so I can make pasteurized apple juice in bottles, and we make about 100 bottles of apple juice probably, and stick it in a couple of old kitchen units in the shed, and then we sort of go and get a couple of bottles, 2 or 3 bottles a week. Before we used to buy a lot of orange juice, and we never buy orange juice at all now. So in terms of reducing your carbon footprint, homegrown apple juice rather than imported orange juice. We maybe occasionally make the odd demijohn of cider some years, and we store all the keeping varieties in trays in the cupboard. And this Spartan was picked in September, well, probably October, and we've still got some of those. We've still got loads of cooking apples, so we can get through to Easter maybe with stored apples, sometimes April, even May occasionally. And then you don't have any apples again for 2 or 3 months because they were a seasonal crop. But nowadays you can buy the same gala in the same supermarket every day of the year, whereas they would have been a seasonal crop. And I often think it's funny how we still celebrate the seasonality of asparagus and runner beans, but most other things we've sort of lost that seasonality because you can just buy them all year round.
So you mentioned the idea, adding biodiversity by putting up bird boxes on poles to control caterpillars. Any other tips for people to create more diversity among the fruit trees? I mean, and obviously in the home garden, then that's a polyculture.
Yeah, I've got lumps of comfrey under some of my trees just as a chop and chuck sort of plant. So that's a big permaculture thing. It's supposed to mine minerals from deep down in the soil, and then by cutting it and mulching it, you just chuck it back on the surface. And just generally encouraging wildlife. I was amazed when I first got my big orchard field that there were no ponds or anything anywhere near. And yet I found toads in the long grass, I found frogs, and I've subsequently put a big pond in. But it was amazing how once you create I always like that, if you build it, they will come quote. But once you let the grass grow long and you don't put any, agri sprays and things around, the wildlife will rock up, and you don't cut your hedges so they become big and thick and birds nest in them. And it's just giving wildlife the chance to do what wildlife wants to do. And the reason wildlife is getting rare, I think, is because there's just nowhere for it to live in so much of the countryside. So if you create the right environment, the wildlife will help you hugely. And the amount of pollinating insects I get is extraordinary. And the bees get all the publicity, but there are beetles, there are microflies, there are hoverflies, all these other insects that do valuable pollination, which are largely overlooked, really.
I've got a question about good companions for fruit trees, and you've mentioned comfrey, and I did that as well with bocking 14, which isn't self-seeding, but is grows by division of the roots, and I found that really successful, and bees love it if you let it flower, if you've got tall enough trees. But I also had marjoram growing under apple trees and other herbs. Do you have some favoured companions?
In the garden, I like alpine strawberry as a ground cover. Let that run amok underneath trees. I think just having herbs in the garden generally is considered a good thing in terms of aromatic sort of properties that they give off, that are enhancing to growth and warding off sort of pests and things. That idea that if you create enough different aromas in the garden, then you confuse the pest species. And there's an awful lot of bird life in my orchard, so they hopefully eat a lot of aphids and caterpillars and things. So yeah, just generally encourage the wildlife, and a great way to encourage wildlife is to put a pond in. It's amazing how frogs will just rock up and then they eat slugs and all sorts of things. So yeah, just wildlife gardening and orcharding go hand in hand, really.
The other thing that we had was we had a native hedgerow, and in that we did have some fruiting standards, things like Prunus marabellum, and that was like the earliest pollen in the garden from trees, and the pollinators just came in. And I don't think you have to plant flowers to encourage pollination. Apple trees just seem to do it all of themselves. And also if you have a mixed system and pears as well, and then perhaps other trees in the system, you just naturally get the pollination.
Yeah, damsons are usually the earliest to come out in my orchard, and I think they get almost exclusively pollinated by sort of micro flies and little tiny things. If you've ever got the time on a beautiful sort of spring day to just stand by a blossom tree, it is really interesting to just see what comes and goes, and the amount of different insects. As I say, bees get an awful lot of publicity, but all these other insects are the sort of unsung heroes really of the garden and the orchard, and they do a huge amount of work, which is why the whole biodiversity sort of loss of insects is such a worrying thing, really, because they do an awful lot of work unseen that benefits us later in the year in terms of fruit harvest.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that we did was we planted drifts of bulbs. So we'd start the year with snowdrops and move through daffodils and narcissi, and we just have loads and loads of flowering bulbs, ending up with English bluebells. And rhizomes. We plant wild garlic as well that would flower later, and that too just created ground cover, beauty, and pollination.
And growing daffodils in orchards was a commercial thing, because if you're a fruit farmer, your cash flow can be very odd because all your harvests at the sort of back end of the year. So they used to grow rows of daffodils, which obviously in sort of February, March would give them a bit of a cash crop and break up the sort of cash flow for the farm. And sometimes you can see on old orchard sites where the trees have gone, but the daffodils still come up in rows. So yeah, that was an example of sort of intercropping, really, of spreading the productivity by having cut flowers in the form of daffodils growing beneath your apple trees. And obviously they can come up and do their thing because they got plenty of light, because the deciduous fruit trees don't have any leaves on at that time of the year. So it's a great example of two things complementing each other, really.
So how do you get your family engaged and interested? Have you got any top tips for?
Well, my children who are 14 and 10, they probably know more about apples than any other kids their age anywhere, I suspect, and I can only apologize to them for that fact. But I think my daughter can probably, run off the names of about 50 varieties without even thinking about it, and probably identify quite a few actually in the hand. But yeah, I think, I was thinking about this the other day. If we've learned anything from the pandemic, this whole sort of idea of engaging with growing and where food comes from and being outside, fresh air, well-being and stuff. I think, a great way to engage people is through food, because I've done a lot of sort of community juicing where, we're squishing apples at an apple day or something. And that really engages people, and people often seem amazed that you squish some apples and you get apple juice as if it's like some amazing thing, and you think, well, what did you think you were going to get out of apples other than? But I think the disconnect between food and people and produce is so great because of things coming in cartons and packaging and bottles, and we need to re-establish these sort of connections with food. And I think engaging people through, whether it's juice or cider or apple pies or apple crisps or whatever, to engage people back to the idea that you can sort of, and to seasonality, to the idea that, eating a Discovery or a Worcester in September straight off the tree is just fantastic. It's not the same as a Gala that's been in cold store for 7 months and has a waxy sheen on it that you can see your face in, which always puts me off slightly. So,
any advice or cautions about starting a community orchard?
Yeah, and community orchards are fantastic. I think it's such a great concept, and I've worked with quite a lot of ones around sort of Worcestershire and the West Midlands over the years. And I think they're very easy to start. People get very enthusiastic. They'll put their hand in their pocket, sponsor a tree, bring the kids along and plant it. It's a bit more difficult 3 years down the road on a cold February Sunday morning when you want some work, people are on a work party perhaps. So some of them work really well, and others are still there as lovely orchards, but perhaps don't get very well looked after. And they do often hinge on one or two highly motivated, passionate individuals. And if those people move away or get ill or something, they sometimes have a habit of, it all sort of comes unstuck a bit. So I think being realistic about what's achievable, who's going to get involved and get their hands dirty. But there are some fantastic urban orchards as well. And sometimes in places where maybe they're not the most affluent areas and things, they do really well because people genuinely want it. I think there can be a little element in some sort of rather well-to-do villages of it being a lovely idea, but when it comes down to it, people don't perhaps, want it as badly. Whereas I think in some poorer areas, they've worked really well because people genuinely want to improve their environment and do something positive and get some fresh organic food on their doorstep. So
for free.
But yeah, they're brilliant. And projects like the Orchard Project, which was formerly the London Orchard Project, just done some fantastic work on urban orchards in all sorts of places. So there is some really good stuff going on out there. And I sometimes think we live in a world where there's just too much bad news and we don't hear the good news, because there are some great things going on. People doing really, really good things.
There certainly are. My last question tonight is, tell me the most surprising thing that ever happened to you in an orchard.
Well, I don't have any Laurie Lee sort of stories about drinking cider with girls called Rosie or anything, but I think the one you're alluding to involves...
I drank cider with a girl called Rosie.
I think the one you're alluding to is the one I mentioned in the book, where there's a fantastic old orchard on the edge of Worcester, where there's, I think it's about 200 years worth of orchard history on this farm, and some huge, massive, really ancient trees. And I was walking around with the farmer one day, who I've known for many years, and one of the huge old apple trees has got a hole in it. So I sort of put my face up to this hole to look inside, and there was a barn owl looking back at me. And I'm not sure who was more surprised, me or the barn owl, but it shows the value of these ancient orchards, because they are just fantastic for nest sites, dead wood, insects, invertebrates, small mammals, reptiles, like you said, all manner of things. And when developers say, can we destroy this old orchard? We'll plant you 2 new ones. It's like, no, because where's the wildlife going to live in the 100 years it takes the young orchards to turn into the old orchards? So it is really important that we sort of passionately defend these ancient orchards. And, they are such wonderful sort of rich habitats in our countryside.
I think so. I mean, they're a beautiful heritage. Well, look, Wade, thank you so much for your time tonight. Wade, I'll just say, is the author of the Orchard book, published by Permanent Publications, which is a book publishing company that I co-founded some decades ago. And when we advertised this talk on social media, someone said, fantastic, Wade is great. He knows everything you need to know about apple trees. So that was pretty good accolade. So thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Wade.